The crystal chandelier cast harsh shadows across the marble floor as three women in designer gowns circled around her like vultures. Their laughter echoed through the charity gala, sharp and cutting. "Did she seriously come here dressed like that?" one whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The woman in the simple navy blazer from Goodwill kept her head high, her calloused hands steady at her sides. What these socialites didn't know was that in exactly 10 minutes, those same hands had commanded respect from world leaders. And when the red carpet rolled out and the presidential seal gleamed in the spotlight, their mockery would turn to stunned silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Sarah Mitchell adjusted the collar of her navy blazer one final time before stepping out of her modest Honda Civic. The parking lot of the Riverside Country Club stretched before her like an ocean of luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMWs, and Teslas gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Her car looked painfully out of place among them, its faded paint and small dent on the rear bumper telling stories these pristine machines would never know. The blazer had cost her $12 at the Goodwill on 5th Street. She'd found it, wedged between a collection of outdated business suits, and despite its slightly worn edges and the tiny pull in the fabric near the left shoulder, it fit her perfectly. The matching pants had been another $8, and the sensible black flats purchased from a discount shoe store downtown completed what she hoped was an appropriate outfit for the annual Children's Foundation charity gala. Sarah had never attended anything quite like this before. As a career military officer who had spent the last 25 years serving her country in various capacities around the globe, charity galas weren't exactly her area of expertise. Her usual wardrobe consisted of crisp uniforms, tactical gear, and the occasional casual outfit for her rare moments of downtime. But when her longtime friend Rebecca Torres, a social worker who ran a local youth center, had invited her to attend as her guest, Sarah couldn't refuse. "It's for a good cause, Sarah," Rebecca had explained over coffee the week before. "The Children's Foundation raises money for underprivileged kids throughout the state. I know it's not your usual scene, but they're honoring local heroes this year, and I thought you might enjoy meeting some like-minded people who care about making a difference." What Rebecca hadn't mentioned was the dress code. While the invitation had simply stated cocktail attire, Sarah quickly realized as she approached the country club's ornate entrance that her interpretation of cocktail attire was vastly different from that of the other attendees. Women in flowing evening gowns that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary swept past her, their jewelry catching the light like tiny stars. Men in perfectly tailored suits that bore the unmistakable marks of custom tailoring chatted in small groups, their watches and cufflinks speaking of wealth that Sarah had never known. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with the evening air, creating an atmosphere of refined luxury that felt both foreign and intimidating. Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't about fitting in with these people or impressing anyone with her appearance. This was about supporting a cause that helped children, something she had dedicated her entire career to protecting, albeit in a very different way. The children she had helped evacuate from war zones, the family she had assisted during humanitarian missions, the young soldiers she had mentored throughout her career, they all reminded her that service came in many forms. The country club's lobby was a masterpiece of old-world elegance. Marble columns stretched toward a vaulted ceiling adorned with classical paintings, while crystal chandeliers cast warm light across Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Sarah's footsteps echoed slightly on the polished floor as she made her way toward the reception desk to check in. "Name, please?" asked the young woman behind the mahogany desk, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her smile professionally practiced. "Sarah Mitchell. I'm here with Rebecca Torres from the Eastside Community Center." The receptionist's fingers flew across her tablet as she located Sarah's name. Ah, yes, table 12. The cocktail reception is already underway in the garden room. And dinner will be served at 7:30. She handed Sarah a small program and a name tag. Enjoy your evening. Sarah pinned the name tag to her blazer and followed the sound of conversation and clinking glasses toward the garden room. The space was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked meticulously maintained gardens, while round tables draped in white linens were scattered throughout the room. Each table was adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces that probably cost more than Sarah typically spent on groceries in a month. The crowd was even more impressive up close. Sarah recognized several faces from the local news, politicians, business leaders, and society figures who regularly appeared in the lifestyle sections of newspapers. Their conversations flowed effortlessly from vacation homes in the Hamptons to upcoming charity events in major cities, a world of privilege and connections that felt entirely separate from Sarah's own experiences. She spotted Rebecca near the bar, engaged in animated conversation with a group of people Sarah didn't recognize. Rebecca caught her eye and waved her over, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Sarah, I'm so glad you made it." Rebecca embraced her friend warmly before turning to introduce her to the group. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Colonel Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh. She runs the pediatric program at St. Mary's Hospital. And this is Michael Chun. He's with the Department of Education." The introductions were pleasant enough, though Sarah noticed the subtle once-over her outfit received from Dr. Walsh. It wasn't overtly rude, but there was a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or mild disapproval, that crossed the woman's perfectly made-up features before being quickly replaced by a polite smile. "Colonel Mitchell," Dr. Walsh said, extending a manicured hand. "How interesting. Are you stationed locally?" "I'm currently between assignments," Sarah replied diplomatically. What she didn't mention was that her current assignment was actually a highly classified position at the Pentagon that she couldn't discuss at a charity gala. "I've been fortunate to serve in various capacities over the years." The conversation continued pleasantly for several minutes, before Michael Chun excused himself to speak with someone across the room. Dr. Walsh followed shortly after, mentioning something about needing to find the Foundation's board members. This left Sarah and Rebecca standing together near the bar. "You look great," Rebecca said quietly, though Sarah detected a note of concern in her voice. "Thanks. I wasn't entirely sure what cocktail attire meant in this context." Sarah gestured subtly toward the elaborate gowns surrounding them. "I may have underestimated the dress code." "You look perfectly appropriate," Rebecca assured her, though they both knew that appropriate and fitting in were two entirely different things. "Besides, what matters is that you're here supporting a good cause. These people spend so much time thinking about appearances, they sometimes forget what's actually important." As if summoned by Rebecca's words, 3 women approached their corner of the bar area. Sarah recognized the type immediately, the kind of wealthy socialites who treated charity events like fashion shows, more concerned with being seen than with the actual cause being supported. They moved with the confidence that came from never having to worry about money, their designer gowns flowing like liquid silk as they glided across the marble floor. The first woman, a tall blonde in a shimmering gold dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, led the group. Her jewelry caught the chandelier light with every movement, and her smile had the practiced quality of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Behind her, a brunette in deep emerald green and a redhead in classic black completed the trio. "Rebecca," the blonde woman said, her voice carrying the particular tone that wealthy people used when they wanted to sound friendly while maintaining their social superiority. "How lovely to see you again." "Hello, Patricia," Rebecca replied, her own voice carefully neutral. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Patricia Whitmore." "Patricia," This is my friend Colonel Sarah Mitchell." Patricia's eyes immediately swept over Sarah's outfit, and this time there was no attempt to hide her assessment. Her gaze lingered on the slight wear at the collar of Sarah's blazer, the sensible shoes, and the complete absence of expensive jewelry. When her eyes met Sarah's again, her smile had taken on a different quality, one that Sarah recognized from her military experience as the look people gave when they thought they had identified an easy target. "How nice," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she found nothing particularly nice about the introduction. "And what brings you to our little gathering, Colonel?" The emphasis she placed on Sarah's rank was subtle but unmistakable, delivered in a way that suggested she either didn't believe it or didn't think it impressive. Sarah had encountered this attitude before, people who viewed military service as something that other people did, not something that deserved particular respect or recognition. "Rebecca invited me," Sarah replied simply. "I'm happy to support any organization that helps children." "Of course," said the brunette, introducing herself as Victoria Ashford. Her emerald dress probably cost more than Sarah's car, and the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the light every time she gestured. "It's always refreshing when people from different backgrounds take an interest in charitable causes." The pause before different backgrounds was loaded with meaning, and Sarah felt Rebecca tense beside her. This was clearly not the first time these women had made someone feel unwelcome at one of these events. "Yes," added the redhead, who identified herself as Catherine Price, "though I must say, we don't often see, well, such practical fashion choices at these gatherings." Her laugh was light and airy, designed to sound innocuous to anyone who might be listening, but Sarah caught the edge beneath it. Sarah had faced down hostile forces in 3 different war zones, negotiated with international diplomats who could end careers with a phone call, and commanded the respect of some of the most powerful people in the world. She was not about to be intimidated by 3 women whose greatest accomplishment appeared to be marrying well and spending money on designer clothing. "I find that what really matters at events like these is the cause being supported, not the cost of what people are wearing," Sarah said evenly, her military training keeping her voice calm and measured despite the growing irritation she felt. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, as if Sarah had said something surprising. "Oh, of course. Though surely you understand that these events are about more than just writing checks. They're about bringing the right people together, creating connections, maintaining certain standards." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The word standards hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that these women had somehow decided that her presence at their exclusive gathering was inappropriate. They saw her thrift store clothing and modest appearance, and had made assumptions about her worthiness to be in their social circle. "I think Sarah understands the importance of service," Rebecca interjected, her voice carrying a warning that the 3 women either didn't catch or chose to ignore. "Oh, I'm sure she does," Victoria said with false sweetness. "Military service is so noble, though I imagine it doesn't leave much time for the finer things in life." Her eyes once again swept over Sarah's outfit, and this time her meaning was unmistakable. Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same composure that had served her well in tense situations throughout her career. These women had no idea who they were dealing with, and she saw no reason to enlighten them. Sometimes the best response to shallow people was to let them reveal their own character without interference. "You're absolutely right," Sarah said pleasantly. "Service does require certain sacrifices, but I've found the rewards more than make up for any inconvenience." Catherine laughed, a sound that managed to be both musical and condescending. "How admirable! Though I must confess, I simply couldn't function without my personal shopper. The thought of having to find appropriate attire for events like these, without professional help, She shuddered dramatically, as if the very idea was unbearable. "Some of us are fortunate enough to have other priorities," Sarah replied, maintaining her pleasant tone even as she recognized a deliberate insult. "Of course," Patricia said, her smile never wavering. "Though surely you realize that appearance matters, especially at events like these. First impressions and all that." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I mean, when one is representing. Well, when one is in a public setting, there's a certain responsibility to present oneself appropriately." The implication was clear. Sarah's appearance was inappropriate, embarrassing, and reflected poorly on everyone around her. It was the kind of calculated social cruelty that wealthy people sometimes practiced, designed to make others feel small while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Rebecca's face had flushed with anger, and Sarah could see her friend preparing to defend her. But before Rebecca could speak, Sarah placed a gentle hand on her arm, a small gesture that conveyed both gratitude and a request to let her handle this herself. "You raise an interesting point about first impressions," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Though I've always found that the most important impressions are the ones that last beyond the initial meeting. Surface appearances can be so misleading." The three women exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether Sarah's comment was meant as a subtle counterattack or simply naive agreement with their position. Sarah's military experience had taught her the value of strategic ambiguity. Sometimes it was better to let opponents wonder about your intentions than to reveal your hand too early. "Well," Patricia said after a moment, her smile becoming slightly strained, "I suppose we all have our own perspectives on these matters." "Indeed we do," Sarah agreed pleasantly. The conversation might have continued in this vein, with veiled insults disguised as polite social commentary. But at that moment, the lights in the garden room dimmed slightly, and a voice came over the sound system asking guests to take their seats for dinner. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more ironic, given what was about to unfold. As the crowd began moving toward their assigned tables, Patricia leaned slightly closer to her companions, though not so close that her voice couldn't be overheard by Sarah and Rebecca. "Really," she murmured, just loud enough to be heard. "Some people simply don't understand that these events have certain expectations. It's almost embarrassing." Her companions nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting they felt they had successfully put an upstart in her place. They had no way of knowing that in less than 10 minutes, their entire understanding of the evening and of the woman they had just dismissed was about to be completely overturned. Sarah simply smiled and began walking toward table 12, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. Behind her, she could hear Rebecca muttering under her breath about entitled people who wouldn't recognize genuine character if it walked up and introduced itself. What none of them knew was that outside the country club, a small motorcade was already pulling into the circular driveway. Black SUVs with government plates were taking their positions, while Secret Service agents in dark suits spoke quietly into their earpieces. At the center of the motorcade, a limousine bearing the presidential seal waited patiently. Inside the garden room, the charity gala was about to become something entirely different, and the woman in the $12 blazer from Goodwill was about to remind everyone present that true distinction had nothing to do with the price of one's clothing. Table 12 was positioned toward the back of the garden room, away from the prime spots near the stage where the foundation's major donors and board members held court. Sarah didn't mind the location. She had spent enough time in military mess halls and field tents to appreciate any meal served on actual china with real silverware. Rebecca slid into the seat beside her, still fuming from their encounter with Patricia and her companions. "I can't believe those women," she muttered, shaking out her napkin with more force than necessary. "The absolute nerve of some people." "It's fine, Rebecca," Sarah said quietly, adjusting her placement so the small pull in her blazer was less visible. "I've dealt with worse. That's not the point." This is supposed to be about helping children, not some twisted fashion show where people judge each other based on designer labels. Sarah glanced around the table as other guests began to arrive. Most seemed pleasant enough, a retired teacher named Dorothy, who had volunteered with the foundation for 15 years, a young couple who ran a small nonprofit focused on literacy programs, and an elderly gentleman named Frank who had apparently donated a significant sum to build a new playground at one of the foundation's partner schools. The conversation at their table flowed easily once everyone was seated. Dorothy regaled them with stories of students she had taught over her 40-year career, while the young couple shared their experiences working with children in underserved communities. Frank, it turned out, was a retired electrician who had built a successful contracting business and now spent his retirement giving back to organizations that supported youth programs. "It's wonderful to see young people like you getting involved," Dorothy said to Rebecca. "Though I must say, it's refreshing to have someone here who understands what real service looks like." She nodded toward Sarah with obvious approval. "Military service is something we don't see enough respect for these days." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, though she noticed that Dorothy's voice carried clearly enough to reach the neighboring tables, where Patricia and her friends had claimed seats much closer to the front of the room. She caught a glimpse of Patricia's expression and saw the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she had heard the comment and didn't appreciate the implication. The first course arrived, a delicate butternut squash soup, garnished with roasted pumpkin seeds and a swirl of cream. It was beautifully presented and probably cost more per bowl than Sarah typically spent on an entire meal, but she had to admit it was delicious. The conversation at their table continued to focus on the foundation's work and the various ways people could contribute to helping children in need. "I've always believed that service comes in many forms," Frank was saying, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke. "Whether it's teaching kids to read, fixing their school's electrical system, or protecting our country, it all matters. It's the intention that counts, not how much money you spend doing it." His words carried a weight that came from decades of honest work and genuine commitment to his community. Sarah found herself thinking about the stark contrast between Frank's humble wisdom and the shallow materialism she had encountered earlier in the evening. Here was a man who had built something meaningful with his hands and was now using his success to help others, while across the room sat women who seemed to measure their worth entirely by the cost of their accessories. As if summoned by her thoughts, Sarah noticed movement at Patricia's table. The blonde socialite was leaning forward, speaking in animated whispers to her companions, while occasionally glancing in Sarah's direction. Victoria and Catherine nodded along, their expressions suggesting they were thoroughly enjoying whatever Patricia was telling them. "Looks like you've made quite an impression," Rebecca murmured, following Sarah's gaze. "Some people need someone to look down on in order to feel good about themselves," Dorothy observed matter-of-factly. "I've seen it plenty of times over the years. Usually says more about them than about whoever they're targeting." The main course was served herb-crusted salmon with seasonal vegetables and wild rice. The presentation was exquisite, and Sarah found herself appreciating the skill that had gone into both the preparation and the plating. She had eaten in military mess halls around the world, where function far outweighed form, and while she didn't need fancy food to be satisfied, she could recognize and appreciate quality when she encountered it. "This is quite a step up from MREs," she commented to Frank, who had been asking about her military experience. "MREs?" asked the young man from the literacy nonprofit. "Meals ready to eat," Sarah explained. "Standard military field rations. They're designed to provide nutrition and calories in situations where cooking isn't practical, but they're not exactly what you'd call gourmet cuisine. I imagine you've eaten in some pretty challenging conditions," Dorothy said with genuine interest. Sarah nodded. thinking back to countless meals shared with fellow service members in places where the primary concern was staying alive rather than enjoying the food. You adapt to whatever the situation requires. Though I have to say, the camaraderie usually made up for any shortcomings in the menu. That's what I love about the military folks I've met over the years, Frank said warmly. There's this sense of shared purpose, of understanding what really matters. It's refreshing in a world where so many people seem obsessed with superficial things. His comment was perfectly timed, as at that moment, laughter erupted from Patricia's table. It was the kind of loud, performative laughter designed to draw attention, and several heads turned in their direction. Patricia was clearly holding court, regaling her table with some story that had everyone in stitches. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she had a strong suspicion she knew what, or rather, who the story was about. The way Patricia's eyes kept flicking in her direction, combined with the theatrical nature of the laughter, suggested that her thrift store outfit had become the evening's entertainment for at least one table of guests. Some people, Rebecca said through gritted teeth, her fork clicking against her plate with unnecessary force. Let it go, Sarah said quietly. They're not worth the energy it would take to be upset about it. But even as she said the words, Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, not anger exactly, but a recognition of injustice that had driven her throughout her military career. She had spent decades fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, standing up to bullies with more power than character, and protecting those who were vulnerable to attack. The situation was different, but the fundamental dynamic was achingly familiar. The charity's executive director, an earnest-looking man in his 50s named Robert Fleming, approached the microphone at the front of the room. The conversation gradually died down as guests turned their attention toward the small stage where he stood. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Children's Foundation's annual gala. Robert began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Tonight, we gather not just to enjoy a wonderful meal in each other's company, but to celebrate the incredible impact we can have when we come together for a common cause. He went on to discuss the Foundation's work over the past year, highlighting programs that had provided educational support, healthcare, and basic necessities to thousands of children throughout the state. The statistics were impressive, but Sarah found herself most moved by the story's brief anecdotes about individual children whose lives had been changed through the Foundation's intervention. We have a young girl named Maria who was struggling in school due to vision problems her family couldn't afford to address, Robert shared. Thanks to our health initiative, she received glasses and is now reading at grade level for the first time in her life. We have a boy named James whose family was facing eviction, and our emergency assistance program helped them stay in their home while his mother found steady employment. These were the stories that mattered, Sarah reflected. Real impact on real lives, measured not in dollars spent, but in problems solved and futures secured. It was the kind of work that reminded her why service in any form was so important. As Robert continued his presentation, Sarah became aware of movement near the room's entrance. Several men in dark suits had appeared, their presence subtle, but unmistakable to anyone with security training. They positioned themselves at strategic points around the room, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd with the professional alertness that Sarah recognized immediately. Secret Service, her pulse quickened slightly as she realized what their presence meant. Someone very important was about to arrive, someone important enough to warrant this level of protection. She glanced around the room to see if anyone else had noticed, but most of the guests were focused on Robert's presentation. Rebecca leaned over and whispered, "Are those ... Yes, Sarah confirmed quietly. At Patricia's table, the socialites were still engaged in their own private conversation, paying little attention to the executive director's speech. Patricia was gesturing with her wine glass, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she made some point that had Victoria covering her mouth to suppress another burst of laughter. Robert Fleming was wrapping up his remarks, thanking the major donors and sponsors who had made the foundation's work possible. "Tonight we also have a very special surprise," he said, his voice taking on a note of excitement. "We've been honored with a visit from someone who embodies the spirit of service that drives our mission." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The pieces were starting to fall into place in a way that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The Secret Service presence, the timing, the reference to service, all of it pointed toward a possibility she desperately hoped was not about to become reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert continued, "it is my tremendous honor to introduce someone who has dedicated her life to protecting and serving others, both in military operations around the world and in her current role advising our nation's leadership on matters of global security." Sarah closed her eyes, knowing with absolute certainty what was coming next. "Please join me in welcoming 5-star General Sarah Mitchell." The room erupted in applause, but Sarah barely heard it over the rushing sound in her ears. This was not supposed to happen. Her presence here was meant to be quiet, private, a simple evening supporting a good cause with her friend. The foundation wasn't supposed to know about her recent promotion, and they certainly weren't supposed to announce it publicly. She opened her eyes to find every person in the garden room looking at her, their faces displaying varying degrees of surprise, confusion, and dawning realization. At table 12, her dinner companions sat frozen, their expressions shifting from shock to amazement as they processed what they had just heard. But it was their reaction at Patricia's table that Sarah found most telling. The socialite's wine glass had stopped halfway to her lips, her mouth slightly open as she stared across the room. Victoria had gone completely pale, while Catherine looked as if she might be sick. The applause continued, growing stronger as people began to understand the significance of what they had just learned. Sarah remained seated for a moment longer, her mind racing through the implications of this unexpected revelation. Her cover was blown, her privacy was compromised, and her quiet evening of supporting a good cause had just become something entirely different. Robert Fleming was still speaking, though Sarah had difficulty focusing on his words. Something about her distinguished service record, her recent assignment to a classified position at the Pentagon, and her unprecedented promotion to 5-star general, a rank that hadn't been awarded in decades. Finally, she stood up, her sensible shoes silent on the marble floor as she made her way toward the front of the room. The applause followed her, but she was acutely aware of the whispered conversations breaking out at tables throughout the garden room. People were processing this information, trying to reconcile the unassuming woman in thrift store clothing with the reality of her actual position and achievements. As she reached the microphone, Sarah caught sight of movement outside the large windows that overlooked the garden. A red carpet was being unrolled across the circular driveway, leading from the country club's entrance to where a large aircraft was preparing to land on the adjacent grounds that had apparently been cleared and secured for this very purpose. Air Force One was coming to pick up the woman these people had dismissed as inappropriately dressed for their charity gala. Sarah stood at the microphone, the weight of 300 pairs of eyes pressing down on her like a physical force. The applause had finally died away, leaving an expectant silence that seemed to stretch endlessly across the garden room. She had addressed Congress, briefed world leaders, and commanded troops in life-or-death situations, but somehow this moment felt more challenging than any of those experiences. "Thank you, Robert," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had served her well throughout her career. "I have to admit, this evening has been full of surprises." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Most of the guests were still processing the revelation of her identity, trying to reconcile the modest woman they had seen throughout the evening with the reality of her extraordinary position and achievements. "When Rebecca invited me tonight, she told me this was about supporting children in need," Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "She was right. But what she didn't mention was how much this evening would remind me why that support is so crucial. She paused, gathering her thoughts while simultaneously aware of the growing commotion outside. Through the large windows she could see military personnel establishing a security perimeter around the landing area where Air Force One would soon touch down. The red carpet stretched like a river of crimson across the manicured grounds, flanked by honor guards who stood at perfect attention. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of working with people from every walk of life, Sarah went on. I've served alongside soldiers who grew up in poverty and others who came from great wealth. I've worked with diplomats who spoke 5 languages and mechanics who never finished high school. What I've learned is that a person's worth has absolutely nothing to do with their background, their bank account, or the cost of their clothing. The silence in the room had taken on a different quality now. People were listening, not just with curiosity, but with growing understanding of the deeper message beneath her words. At table 12, Rebecca sat with tears in her eyes, finally understanding why her friend had handled the evening's cruelty with such remarkable grace. The children this foundation serves understand something that adults sometimes forget, Sarah continued. They judge people by their actions, not their accessories. They value kindness over status, integrity over image. They see through pretense to the person underneath. Her eyes found Patricia's table, where the 3 socialites sat in varying states of shock and mortification. Patricia's face had gone completely white beneath her carefully applied makeup, while Victoria seemed to be trying to make herself invisible by sinking lower in her chair. Catherine was staring at her hands, apparently unable to meet anyone's gaze. I think about those children when I encounter adults who have forgotten these simple truths, Sarah said, her voice remaining gentle despite the steel beneath it. Adults who believe that surface appearances matter more than substance, who mistake expensive clothes for personal worth, who think that mocking others somehow elevates themselves. The sound of rotors filled the air outside as helicopters moved into position around the landing zone. Sarah could see the flashing lights of the escort aircraft as they established their protective formation, preparing for the arrival of the most recognizable plane in the world. But here's what I've learned in 25 years of service, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. True distinction isn't something you can buy in a store or inherit from your family. It's something you earn through your choices, your character, and your commitment to something larger than yourself. Frank, the retired electrician at table 12, began to clap slowly. The sound echoed through the silent room for a moment before Dorothy joined him, then the young couple from the literacy nonprofit. Within seconds, the applause had spread throughout the garden room, building to a crescendo that drowned out even the approaching aircraft. Sarah waited for the applause to subside before speaking again. The Foundation's work matters because it helps children develop that kind of character. It teaches them that their circumstances don't define their potential, that their current situation doesn't limit their future possibilities. Outside, the distinctive silhouette of Air Force One appeared against the darkening sky, its massive form descending toward the prepared landing area with the precision that marked all military operations. The sight of the presidential aircraft seemed to render the entire crowd speechless, as if the reality of Sarah's position was finally sinking in completely. I want to thank each of you for your support of this organization, Sarah said as the engines of Air Force One wound down outside. Your contributions, whether measured in dollars, time, or simple human compassion, make a real difference in real lives. She stepped back from the microphone as Robert Fleming returned to the stage, but the executive director seemed almost too stunned to speak. The revelation of Sarah's identity had clearly caught him as off guard as everyone else, and he appeared to be struggling with how to proceed. Ladies and gentlemen, he finally managed, I believe General Mitchell needs to ... He gestured helplessly toward the windows, where the red carpet and honor guard were clearly visible in the floodlights that had been set up around the landing area. The implications were obvious. Sarah wasn't just attending this charity gala. She was being collected from it by the most important aircraft in the American military. "Thank you again for a lovely evening," Sarah said simply, then began making her way toward the exit. The crowd parted before her like water, guests stepping aside to create a clear path toward the door. Their faces showed a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and dawning respect as they watched the woman they had barely noticed or actively dismissed prepare to board the aircraft that served the President of the United States. As Sarah walked through the garden room, she passed Patricia's table. The three socialites sat frozen, apparently unable to process what was happening around them. Sarah paused for just a moment, looking down at the women who had spent the evening mocking her appearance and questioning her worthiness to attend their exclusive gathering. "Have a wonderful rest of your evening," she said pleasantly, her tone carrying no trace of malice or satisfaction. "I hope you'll consider increasing your support for the Foundation's work. The children really do need all the help they can get." Patricia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Victoria had gone so pale that Sarah briefly worried she might faint, while Catherine seemed to have developed a sudden fascination with her untouched dessert plate. Sarah continued toward the exit, where Secret Service agents were waiting to escort her to the aircraft. Behind her, the garden room erupted in whispered conversations as guests tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. "Did you see her face? I can't believe they actually said those things to her. A 5-star. General, do you have any idea how rare that is? She handled it with such class. I would have died of embarrassment." Rebecca caught up with Sarah just before she reached the door, her face flushed with a mixture of pride and lingering anger at how her friend had been treated. "Sarah, I had no idea," she said breathlessly. "I mean, I knew you were important, but I never imagined." "It's all right, Rebecca," Sarah replied, embracing her friend warmly. "Thank you for inviting me. It was educational. I'm so sorry about those awful women. If I had known they were going to—" "You have nothing to apologize." Sarah interrupted gently. "Their behavior says everything about them, and nothing about you or me. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I think they've learned something valuable tonight." Through the open doors, they could see the red carpet stretching across the grounds, lined with military personnel standing at perfect attention. Air Force One sat majestically at the end of the carpet, its blue and white livery gleaming under the floodlights. The presidential seal on the side of the aircraft caught the light, a symbol of power and authority that left no doubt about the importance of its passengers. "I should go," Sarah said, glancing toward the waiting aircraft. "Duty calls." She hugged Rebecca one final time, then walked through the doors and onto the red carpet. The honor guards snapped to attention as she passed, their salutes crisp and respectful. Each step she took seemed to emphasize the vast gulf between perception and reality, between the assumptions people had made about her and the truth of who she actually was. Behind her, the guests from the charity gala had moved to the windows to watch her departure. Many were pulling out their phones to capture photos and videos, suddenly realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The woman they had seen eating dinner in thrift store clothing was now walking up the steps of Air Force One, acknowledged by the most elite military personnel in the country. As Sarah reached the aircraft steps, she turned back toward the country club for one final look. Through the large windows of the garden room, she could see the crowd of guests watching her departure. Most were expressions of amazement and respect, but her eyes sought out Patricia's table one last time. The three socialites were now standing at the window with everyone else, their earlier confidence completely shattered. Patricia's hand was pressed against the glass as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Victoria seemed to be leaning on Catherine for support, while Catherine herself looked as if she had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Sarah raised her hand in a small wave toward the window, not directed at anyone in particular, but visible to everyone watching. It was a gesture of farewell, but also of forgiveness. She held no grudge against the women who had mocked her, no desire for revenge or further humiliation. Their own behavior had been punishment enough, the aircraft's crew. Chief appeared at the top of the steps, saluting smartly as Sarah approached. "Good evening, General. I hope your evening was productive." "Very much so, Sergeant," Sarah replied as she climbed the steps. "Though not quite in the way I expected." As she disappeared into the aircraft, the engines began to spool up for departure. The honor guard maintained their positions until the massive plane began to taxi toward the runway. Their salutes held steady until Air Force One was airborne and climbing into the night sky. Inside the country club, the charity gala continued. But the mood had fundamentally changed. Conversations now centered around the evening's unexpected revelation, with guests sharing their observations and trying to process what they had witnessed. At table 12, Frank was shaking his head in amazement. 25 years I've been coming to these things, and I've never seen anything like that." She was so gracious, Dorothy marveled. Even after the way those women treated her, she never lost her composure. "That's what real class looks like," the young man from the literacy nonprofit observed. "Not the fake kind that comes from money, but the genuine article that comes from character." Rebecca sat quietly, still processing everything that had happened. She had invited her friend to a simple charity dinner, never imagining it would turn into a lesson about dignity, humility, and the difference between actual worth and perceived status. At Patricia's table, the conversation was considerably more subdued. The three women sat in uncomfortable silence, each lost in her own thoughts about the evening's events and their role in them. "We had no way of knowing," Victoria finally whispered, though her words lacked conviction. "That's not the point," Catherine replied quietly. "We shouldn't have said those things regardless of who she was." Patricia remained silent, staring out the window where Air Force One had disappeared into the darkness. For the first time in years, she was forced to confront the reality of her own behavior and the shallowness of the values she had built her life around. The charity gala concluded an hour later, but the impact of the evening would linger far longer. For most of the guests, it had been a powerful reminder about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and treating everyone with dignity and respect. For three women in particular, it had been a life-changing lesson about the difference between true distinction and mere pretension, a lesson delivered not through cruelty or revenge, but through the quiet dignity of a woman who understood that real strength never needs to diminish others to prove itself. 3 weeks after the charity gala, Patricia Whitmore sat in her marble-floored kitchen, staring at her phone screen with trembling hands. The video had gone viral. Someone at the event had captured Sarah's speech and departure on Air Force One, and it had been shared across every social media platform imaginable. The comment section was brutal, with thousands of people expressing their disgust at the behavior of the rich women who mocked a war hero. The worst part was that Patricia could see herself in several of the clips, her face clearly visible as she whispered cruel comments about Sarah's clothing. Internet detectives had already identified her, Victoria and Catherine, posting their names and photos alongside scathing commentary about their behavior. The local newspapers had picked up the story, and Patricia's phone had been ringing nonstop, with interview requests she had no intention of accepting. Her husband Charles entered the kitchen, his expression grim as he held up the morning edition of the Herald Tribune. The headline read, "Local socialites mock 5-star general at charity event." Below, it was a photo of Sarah walking up the steps of Air Force One, juxtaposed with a grainy image of Patricia's shocked face at the country club window. "The board is meeting this afternoon," Charles said quietly, setting the newspaper on the granite countertop. "They want to discuss my position as chairman of Whitmore Industries." Patricia felt her stomach drop. Charles had built his company from a small family business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, but his success depended heavily on relationships with government contractors and military suppliers. Having his wife publicly humiliate a five-star general wasn't exactly good for business. "They can't hold me responsible for something you did," Charles continued, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. "But the optics are terrible, Patricia. Some of our biggest contracts are with the Department of Defense." She wanted to defend herself, to explain that they had no way of knowing who Sarah really was, but the words felt hollow even in her own mind. The truth was becoming increasingly clear. It shouldn't have mattered who Sarah was. Their behavior had been inexcusable regardless of her rank or position. Across town, Victoria Ashford was facing her own reckoning. She sat in the offices of Ashford and Associates, the prestigious law firm her father had built and she had inherited. Listening to her senior partners express their concerns about the firm's reputation. "The video has been viewed over 2 million times," her partner James Morrison was saying, his voice carefully professional despite the obvious tension in the room. "Our clients are asking questions, Victoria. High-profile cases require public trust, and right now—" He gestured helplessly at his laptop screen, where the video was paused on a frame showing Victoria laughing at something Patricia had said about Sarah's appearance. The timestamp showed it was just minutes before the revelation of Sarah's true identity. "I've already had 3 clients request different representation," added Sarah Chen, another senior partner. "The Henderson case is particularly problematic. They're a military family dealing with a wrongful death suit. They don't want to be represented by someone who publicly mocked a service member." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years of building her reputation crumbling around her. She had worked twice as hard as her male colleagues to establish herself in a competitive field, and now all of that effort was being undone by a single evening of poor judgment. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. The partners exchanged glances before James spoke again. "We think it might be best if you took a leave of absence. Let this blow over. Maybe consider some kind of public apology or charitable work that might help repair the damage." Meanwhile, Catherine Price was discovering that her position as director of the Hampton Museum of Fine Arts was also in jeopardy. The museum's board had called an emergency meeting after receiving dozens of complaints from patrons who had seen the viral video. The museum's mission is to promote cultural understanding and appreciation. Board Chairman Dr. William Foster was explaining to the assembled members. Miss Price's behavior at the charity gala directly contradicts these values. Catherine sat at the far end of the polished conference table, feeling increasingly isolated as board member after board member expressed their concerns. The museum depended on donations from a diverse group of supporters, including many veterans organizations and military families who had been particularly offended by the video. "I think we need to consider whether Miss Price's continued leadership is compatible with the museum's reputation," said board member Elizabeth Warren, a retired professor whose own military service during Vietnam gave her words particular weight. "Public institutions must be held to higher standards." The irony wasn't lost on Catherine that she was being judged by a group of her peers, just as she had judged Sarah 3 weeks earlier. The difference was that her judgment had been based on superficial appearances, while theirs was based on her actual behavior and character. Back at the Riverside Country Club, the fallout was equally severe. Club President Richard Hamilton stood before an emergency meeting of the membership committee, addressing a room full of concerned members who had gathered to discuss the incident. "The club's reputation has been severely damaged," Hamilton was saying, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We've received hundreds of calls and emails from people expressing their outrage at what happened here. Several corporate sponsors have already canceled their events." The committee members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Many of them had been present at the charity gala, and while most hadn't participated in the mockery of Sarah, They also hadn't spoken up to stop it. What's particularly troubling, Hamilton continued, is that this happened at a charity event meant to help children. The Children's Foundation has received an enormous increase in donations. Since the video went viral, people want to support the organization that honored General Mitchell. But they don't want to hold their events here. Margaret Coleman, a longtime member who had served on the club's board for over a decade, raised her hand. What about the 3 women involved? Are we taking any action regarding their memberships? Hamilton sighed deeply. That's what we're here to discuss. The behavior captured in that video goes against everything this club claims to stand for. We pride ourselves on being a place where successful people can gather in an atmosphere of mutual respect and dignity. The video had indeed changed everything, but not just for Patricia, Victoria, and Catherine. The entire community was grappling with uncomfortable questions about class, privilege, and the way people treated those they perceived as beneath their social status. At Eastside Community Center, Rebecca Torres was dealing with the positive side of the viral phenomenon. Donations had poured in from around the country, with people expressing their support for the Children's Foundation and their admiration for Sarah's dignity in the face of such treatment. I can't believe this is happening, she said to her assistant coordinator, Maria Santos, as they sorted through boxes of donated supplies that had arrived just that morning. We've received more support in 3 weeks than we usually get in an entire year. Maria smiled as she opened another package filled with children's books. People were inspired by your friend's speech, and I think they were disgusted by how those women treated her. Sometimes it takes something shocking to make people pay attention to what's really important. The Children's Foundation had also received an unexpected visitor the previous week. Dorothy Williams, the retired teacher who had been sitting at table 12 during the gala, had arrived with a check for $50,000, her entire retirement savings account. I've been thinking about that evening ever since it happened, Dorothy had explained to Rebecca. About the difference between real character and fake sophistication. I realized I've been sitting on money I don't need while children in our community are going without basic necessities. Similar stories were playing out across the country as the video continued to spread. Veterans organizations were using it as an example of the respect that service members deserved. Business schools were analyzing it as a case study in the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance. Social media influencers were creating content about the dangers of judging people based on superficial characteristics. But perhaps the most significant impact was occurring in smaller, more personal ways. In coffee shops and offices, at dinner tables and book clubs, people were having conversations about their own behavior and assumptions. Parents were using the story to teach their children about respect and humility. Managers were reconsidering how they treated employees from different backgrounds. At a small diner in downtown Springfield, 2 waitresses were discussing the video during their break. I keep thinking about how calm she stayed, said Jenny Martinez, a single mother who had been working at the diner for 3 years while putting herself through nursing school. If someone had talked to me like that, I probably would have lost my temper. Her coworker, Susan Walsh, nodded thoughtfully. My daughter showed me the video. She said it made her think about how she treats the new kids at school, especially the ones who don't have designer clothes and expensive phones. These conversations were happening everywhere, sparked by a story that had touched something fundamental about human dignity and respect. The viral video had become more than just entertainment. It had become a mirror in which people could examine their own behavior and values. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a psychology professor at the State University, had begun incorporating the incident into his lectures on social psychology and group dynamics. What we see here is a perfect example of how in-group bias and status anxiety can lead people to dehumanize others, he explained to his packed auditorium. The 3 women created an artificial hierarchy based on material possessions then. use that hierarchy to justify cruel behavior toward someone they perceived as an outsider. His students were fascinated by the real-world application of the theories they had been studying. Many admitted that they had engaged in similar behavior themselves, judging classmates based on their clothing, cars, or family backgrounds rather than their character or achievements. The ripple effects continued to spread. High schools were organizing assemblies about bullying and respect. Churches were delivering sermons about humility and the dangers of pride. Corporate training programs were using the video to illustrate the importance of treating all employees and customers with dignity. Even fashion magazines had begun running articles about the pressure to judge people based on their appearance, with several major publications featuring stories about successful people who chose to dress modestly despite their wealth and status. But while the broader conversation was largely positive, focusing on lessons learned and behavior changed, the three women at the center of the story were still struggling with the personal consequences of their actions. Patricia had begun seeing a therapist, Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in helping people process public humiliation and rebuild their sense of self-worth. The hardest part, Patricia admitted during one of their sessions, is realizing that this isn't something that happened to me. This is something I did. I can't blame anyone else or claim I was misunderstood. The video shows exactly who I was. At that moment, Dr. Foster nodded sympathetically. Acknowledgement is the first step toward genuine change. But it's important to remember that one moment of poor judgment doesn't define your entire character. The question now is what you choose to do with this experience. Patricia had already begun making changes. She had quietly resigned from the boards of several charity organizations, feeling that her presence would be a distraction from their important work. She had also started volunteering at a local homeless shelter, working in the kitchen and helping to serve meals to people who reminded her daily that dignity had nothing to do with designer clothing. The work was humbling in the best possible way. She found herself serving meals to veterans, single mothers, elderly people on fixed incomes, and others who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. Many of them treated her with kindness and respect despite having no idea who she was or what she had done. Victoria had taken a similar path, using her legal skills to provide pro bono services to low-income families, dealing with housing issues and immigration problems. The work put her in direct contact with people who were fighting for basic dignity and respect in a system that often seemed stacked against them. Catherine had thrown herself into developing new educational programs at the museum, focusing on making art and culture accessible to underserved communities. She had organized free admission days for military families and school groups from low-income neighborhoods. All three women were slowly learning what Sarah had tried to convey in her speech that night, that true worth came from one's actions and character, not from external markers of status or success. As the weeks passed, the viral video began to fade from the news cycle, replaced by other stories and scandals. But its impact continued to resonate in ways both large and small, reminding people everywhere that in a world obsessed with appearances, the most important qualities remained invisible to the eye. 6 months had passed since the charity gala incident, and Sarah Mitchell found herself in an unexpected position, not as the subject of a viral video, but as someone grappling with the unintended consequences of her newfound fame. The Pentagon had assigned her a media liaison officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Park, whose job was to handle the constant stream of interview requests, speaking invitations, and media inquiries that continued to flood her office. "General, we have 17 more requests this morning," Lieutenant Colonel Park informed her as she reviewed classified briefings in her secure office. "CNN wants to do a feature on leadership under pressure. Harvard Business School is requesting you keynote their ethics symposium, and there's a documentary crew that wants to follow you for a month." Sarah looked up from her papers, rubbing her temples. The irony wasn't lost on her that an evening meant to quietly support children in need had turned her into an unwilling symbol of dignity under fire. "David, I appreciate that people want to hear about leadership and character, but I'm a military officer, not a motivational speaker." "Yes, ma'am, but with respect, the impact has been extraordinary. We're getting reports from recruitment offices across the country about increased interest in military service, particularly among young women who saw your speech. The Joint Chiefs are calling it the most effective recruitment tool in a decade." The knock on her office door interrupted their conversation. Master Sergeant Rebecca Collins, her aide-de-camp, entered with a serious expression. "General, there's someone here to see you. No appointment, but she says it's urgent and personal. A Patricia Whitmore." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. The last person she had expected to see walking into the Pentagon was one of the women who had mocked her at the charity gala. "Send her in, Sergeant." A few minutes later, Patricia entered Sarah's office looking remarkably different from the confident socialite who had held court at the country club 6 months earlier. Her designer clothes had been replaced with a simple blue dress and modest jewelry. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face bore the unmistakable signs of someone who had been doing some serious soul-searching. "General Mitchell," Patricia began, her voice slightly trembling, "thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to ask for your time." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit down. What brings you to Washington?" Patricia took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I needed to apologize. Not the kind of public apology my lawyers suggested, or the social media post my publicist recommended. A real apology, face-to-face, for how I treated you that night." The office fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system. Sarah studied Patricia's face, noting the genuine distress and remorse in her eyes. This was clearly not the same woman who had mocked her appearance at the charity gala. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand how I became someone who could treat another human being the way I treated you," Patricia continued. "I've been in therapy. I've been volunteering at a homeless shelter, and I've been forced to confront some very uncomfortable truths about myself." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. "What kind of truths?" "That I built my entire sense of self-worth on superficial things. Expensive clothes, exclusive clubs, being seen with the right people. I treated other people as props in my own little drama, ranking them based on how much money they appeared to have or how useful they might be to my social status." Patricia's voice cracked slightly. "I was empty inside, and I filled that emptiness by putting other people down." The confession hung in the air between them. Sarah had dealt with many different types of people throughout her career: enemy combatants, difficult allies, political leaders with hidden agendas, but genuine remorse was something that couldn't be faked, and she could see it clearly in Patricia's demeanor. "The worst part," Patricia went on, "is that even if you had been exactly who I thought you were, just a regular person in thrift store clothes, my behavior would have been equally wrong. It took becoming a viral villain for me to realize that basic human decency isn't something you reserve for people who impress you." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's a difficult lesson to learn, especially in such a public way." "I deserved it," Patricia said firmly. "Every consequence, every bit of public shame, every friendship I lost. What I didn't deserve was the grace you showed that night. You could have destroyed me with a single sentence, but instead you took the high road. Even in your speech, you taught rather than attacked." The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. Master Sergeant Collins entered again, this time with an expression of barely controlled amazement. "General, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Victoria Ashford and Catherine Price are here. They're asking to join Ms. Whitmore's meeting." Sarah looked at Patricia, who seemed equally surprised. "I didn't tell them I was coming," Patricia said quickly. We haven't really spoken since that night. Send them in, Sarah. Decided. A few minutes later, all 3 women who had mocked her at the charity gala were sitting in her Pentagon office. Victoria looked as transformed as Patricia, her designer suit replaced with professional but modest attire, her demeanor humble rather than haughty. Catherine appeared similarly changed, her earlier arrogance replaced by obvious nervousness and genuine remorse. "This is unexpected," Sarah observed. "Are you here together?" "We ran into each other in the lobby," Victoria explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess we all had the same idea." Catherine spoke up, her words coming in a rush. "General Mitchell, I've been trying to work up the courage to contact you for months. What we did was inexcusable, and I needed you to know that I understand that. Now, we all needed to face you," Victoria added. "Not for our own peace of mind, but because you deserved to hear real apologies from the people who wronged you." Sarah looked at the 3 women sitting before her, noting the genuine transformation in each of them. The confident socialites who had dismissed her based on her appearance had been replaced by humbled individuals who had clearly spent considerable time reflecting on their behavior and its consequences. "Tell me about these past 6 months," Sarah said. "What have you learned?" Patricia spoke first. "I learned that I was living a completely superficial life. I thought status and appearance were everything, but I had no real relationships, no meaningful purpose, no genuine self-worth. The public humiliation forced me to examine who I really was, and I didn't like what I found." Victoria nodded in agreement. "I lost clients, respect, and my position at the law firm. But in a way, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. I started doing pro bono work for low-income families, and for the first time in my career, I felt like I was actually helping people instead of just making money. I've been working with underserved communities at the museum," Catherine added, "creating programs for children who would never otherwise have access to art and culture. It's shown me how narrow my world had become, how many amazing people I had been ignoring because they didn't fit my idea of what mattered." Sarah listened carefully to each woman's account of their transformation. As a military leader, she had seen many people face the consequences of their actions, and she had learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and empty words designed to minimize punishment. "What you're describing sounds like real change," she said finally. "But I have to ask, are you here because you've genuinely learned from this experience, or because you want absolution from me to help repair your reputations?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia was the first to respond. "Honestly, 6 months ago, I would have been here looking for forgiveness to help restore my social standing. But the truth is, my old life is gone, and I don't want it back. I found something better, a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on other people's opinions or my position in some artificial hierarchy." Victoria and Catherine expressed similar sentiments, describing how their forced exile from their previous social circles had led them to discover more meaningful ways to spend their time and energy. "We're not asking for your forgiveness," Victoria said. "We don't deserve it, and we don't expect it. We just needed you to know that your response to our cruelty taught us something important about character and dignity." Sarah stood and walked to the window of her office, looking out at the bustling activity of the Pentagon complex. Thousands of people worked in this building, dedicated to protecting and serving their country, and most of them would never receive public recognition for their sacrifices. The viral video had made her a symbol, but she was uncomfortable with the pedestal it had placed her on. "Can I tell you something?" she said, turning back to face the 3 women. "That night at the charity gala wasn't the first time someone had judged me based on my appearance. Throughout my military career, I've encountered people who made assumptions about my capabilities based on my gender, my size, or my background." She returned to her desk, her expression thoughtful. What made that evening different wasn't the mockery itself, but the fact that it happened at an event meant to help children. I kept thinking about the kids the foundation serves, and how they would feel if they knew that the adults raising money to help them were simultaneously looking down on people who didn't meet their standards. Patricia wiped away tears that had begun forming in her eyes. We were everything wrong with the world, weren't we? Judging people by their clothes while claiming to care about children in need. What matters now is what you do going forward. Sarah replied, "Real change isn't about a single moment of recognition or remorse. It's about consistent choices, day after day, to treat every person you encounter with dignity and respect." The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah sharing stories from her military experience about the importance of character over appearance, and the three women describing their ongoing efforts to rebuild their lives around more meaningful values. As the meeting drew to a close, Catherine asked a question that surprised everyone. "General Mitchell, do you think it's possible for people like us to really change? Or are we just going through the motions because we got caught?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I've seen hardened soldiers transform into compassionate leaders, and I've seen people who seemed destined for greatness destroy themselves through poor choices. Change is always possible, but it requires genuine commitment to growth, not just regret over consequences." She stood, signaling that the meeting was ending. "The fact that you're here, having this conversation, suggests you're serious about change. But the real test will be how you behave when no one is watching, when there are no cameras or consequences to motivate you." As the three women prepared to leave, Patricia turned back with one final question. "Is there anything we can do? Any way to make amends for what we did?" Sarah smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Keep doing what you're already doing. Help people who need it. Treat everyone with respect, and remember that true distinction comes from character, not clothing. And maybe, when you encounter someone else making the same mistakes you made, you can help them understand what you've learned." After they left, Sarah sat alone in her office, reflecting on the unexpected visit. Lieutenant Colonel Park returned with more media requests, but she waved them away for the moment. The viral video had created a teachable moment that had resonated far beyond what any of them could have anticipated. But perhaps the most important lesson was playing out right here, in the quiet transformation of three people who had been forced to confront their own prejudices and shallow values. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most powerful changes happened not in grand gestures or public speeches, but in the private moments when people chose to examine their own behavior and commit to doing better. The three women who had just left her office would never be the same people who had mocked her at the charity gala, and that transformation might ultimately prove more valuable than any viral video or public recognition. 2 years had passed since the charity gala that changed everything. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium of the newly constructed Children's Foundation Leadership Center, looking out at an audience that would have been unimaginable that night at the Riverside Country Club. The crowd included military families, community volunteers, business leaders who had genuinely earned their success through service to others, and dozens of children from the Foundation's programs. The building itself stood as a testament to how far ripples could spread from a single moment. Donations inspired by the viral video had funded not just this new facility, but scholarship programs, mentorship initiatives, and community outreach efforts across 3 states. What had started as public outrage over cruel behavior had transformed into a movement focused on character development and authentic leadership. When I accepted the invitation to speak at tonight's dedication, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium, I was reminded of something my commanding officer told me early in my career. True leaders aren't made in moments of triumph, but in how they respond when others stumble. In the front row sat Rebecca Torres, now the Foundation's executive director, her face beaming with pride at how much the organization had grown. Beside her sat Frank Williams, the retired electrician whose wisdom at table 12 had proven more valuable than any expensive education. Dorothy Coleman had traveled from her retirement community specifically for tonight's event, her walker decorated with small American flags, but perhaps the most remarkable sight was in the third row, where Patricia Whitmore, Victoria Ashford, and Catherine Price sat together. They weren't there as guests seeking recognition or social status. Patricia wore the same modest blue dress she had chosen for her Pentagon visit, while Victoria and Catherine were dressed in simple, professional attire that reflected their new priorities. Patricia had indeed transformed her life completely. She had sold her mansion and moved to a modest apartment, using the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund for children from low-income families. Her days were now spent coordinating volunteers at 3 different homeless shelters and teaching financial literacy classes to women transitioning out of difficult situations. Victoria had left private practice entirely, joining a legal aid organization, where she specialized in helping veterans navigate disability claims and housing issues. Her expensive car had been replaced with a reliable sedan, and her designer wardrobe had given way to practical clothes, suitable for visiting clients in hospitals and government offices. Catherine had revolutionized the Hampton Museum's community engagement programs, creating mobile art installations that brought culture directly to underserved neighborhoods. She had also started teaching art classes at the local community college, finding more satisfaction in watching students discover their creativity than she had ever found in attending exclusive gallery openings. Character, Sarah continued from the podium, isn't something you inherit or purchase. It's something you build through consistent choices to put service above self, compassion above comfort, and integrity above image. The speech wasn't about the viral video or the charity gala incident. Sarah had deliberately avoided dwelling on that night, choosing instead to focus on the positive changes that had emerged from it. She spoke about the young people in the audience who were already demonstrating leadership in their schools and communities, about the volunteers who showed up every day without recognition or reward, and about the power of second chances. "Some of the most inspiring people I know," she said, her eyes briefly meeting those of Patricia, Victoria, and Catherine, "are individuals who encountered their worst selves and chose to become something better. They remind us that our past mistakes don't have to define our future contributions." After the ceremony, a reception was held in the center's community room. The space buzzed with conversations between people who might never have met under other circumstances: homeless shelter residents chatting with suburban volunteers, military veterans sharing stories with college students, and children from the Foundation's programs showing their artwork to admiring adults. Sarah found herself in conversation with Maria Santos, now a registered nurse thanks to a scholarship funded by donations inspired by the viral video. "General Mitchell, I wanted to thank you personally, not just for the scholarship program, but for showing all of us what real dignity looks like." Before Sarah could respond, a young voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, are you the lady from the video?" They turned to see a girl of about 12. Her school uniform slightly wrinkled from a long day of classes. Sarah knelt down to the child's eye level. "I am. What's your name?" "I'm Sophia Rodriguez. My mom showed me the video last year when some kids at school were making fun of my clothes." The girl's voice was confident despite the serious topic. "She said you prove that what matters is what's inside, not what you're wearing on the outside." Sarah smiled warmly. "Your mom sounds very wise. And you know what? I bet you're pretty wise too." "I am," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "I'm going to be a doctor someday. And when I am, I'm going to treat all my patients with respect, no matter what they look like or how much money they have." As Sophia skipped away to rejoin her family, Sarah realized this was what truly mattered, not the viral fame or the media attention, but the real impact on real lives. A 12-year-old girl now understood. Something about dignity and respect that some adults twice her age were still learning. Patricia approached hesitantly, waiting for Sarah's conversation with Maria to conclude before stepping forward. "General Mitchell, I hope it's appropriate for me to be here tonight." "Of course it is," Sarah replied. "This center exists to help people grow and change. That includes all of us. I wanted you to know that the scholarship fund hit its 5-year funding goal last month. We'll be able to help another 200 children pursue their education." Sarah nodded approvingly. Patricia's transformation had been the most dramatic of the three women, perhaps because she had fallen the furthest. But her commitment to change appeared genuine and lasting. Victoria joined them, having just finished a conversation with a veteran whose disability claim she had successfully processed. "It's amazing to see all this," she said, gesturing around the bustling reception. "When I think about who I was 2 years ago, Focus on who you are now," Sarah interrupted gently, "and who you're still becoming." Catherine appeared with a group of children from her art program, their faces bright with excitement as they showed off drawings they had made during the reception. "General Mitchell, would you sign these for them? They're so proud of their work." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes sitting with the children, admiring their artwork and asking thoughtful questions about their creative choices. She signed each drawing with a personalized message, treating each child's work with the same respect she might give to a military briefing or diplomatic document. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing outside the leadership center with Rebecca, looking up at the building that had emerged from such an unlikely beginning. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if those women hadn't said what they said that night?" Rebecca asked. Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I think about Sofia Rodriguez and Maria Santos and all the other people whose lives have been touched by what grew out of that moment. Maybe everything happened exactly as it was supposed to." "The ripple effect has been incredible," Rebecca agreed. "We've had foundations from 12 different states contact us about replicating our programs. The scholarship fund has inspired similar initiatives nationwide. And those 3 women have become some of our most dedicated supporters." "People underestimate the power of genuine transformation," Sarah observed. "When someone truly changes, it creates the possibility for others to change too." A year later, Sarah received an invitation that made her smile. Patricia Whitmore was getting married, not to another wealthy businessman seeking social connections, but to David Chun, a social worker she had met while volunteering at the homeless shelter. The invitation was handwritten on simple cardstock, and the venue was the community center where they had met while serving meals to families in need. Wedding was small and intimate, focusing on the couple's shared commitment to service rather than displaying wealth or status. Patricia's dress was elegant but modest, purchased from a local boutique rather than a designer salon. The reception featured food catered by a restaurant that employed formerly homeless individuals as part of a job training program. In her brief speech at the reception, Patricia made no mention of her past life or the viral video that had changed everything. Instead, she spoke about gratitude, second chances, and the joy of building a life based on genuine values rather than artificial status. "David taught me that love isn't about what you can offer someone materially," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "It's about what you can become together when you're both committed to something larger than yourselves." Victoria had become the maid of honor, while Catherine served as the wedding photographer, a skill she had developed while documenting her museum's community programs. All 3 women had found their way to a different kind of happiness, one built on purpose rather than prestige. As Sarah watched the simple celebration unfold, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. A moment of cruelty had sparked a conversation about character that had ultimately transformed multiple lives. The viral video was now just a footnote in a larger story about redemption, growth, and the power of choosing kindness over judgment. The $12 blazer from Goodwill still hung in Sarah's closet, though she had been promoted beyond the need to worry about dress codes or public appearances. Sometimes she wore it to remind herself that true distinction never went out of style, and that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons or strategies, but with simple dignity in the face of small-minded cruelty. In the end, the story wasn't really about three rich women who mocked someone's clothes, or even about a general who showed grace under pressure. It was about the possibility of transformation that exists in every human heart, waiting for the right moment to emerge and create something beautiful from something broken. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.